Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, or good evening if you happen to be listening to this recording at a later time. This is Amy Jauman. I'm the Chief Learning Officer for the National Institute for Social Media, and today we're going to be talking about influencing through information, specifically about explaining the value of certification. Now, when we promoted this particular topic, we talked to a lot of people that weren't necessarily looking for answers to how to best promote the value of their certification, but they were looking for how to promote their experience, their education, anything that's going to kind of set them apart. So if that's you, don't panic. You're in the right place. You'll hear throughout the webinar me talk a lot about certification, a lot about the social media strategy certification specifically, but these concepts that we'll go through today actually have a very wide application to anybody who is either transitioning, maybe they have changed careers, or maybe they're in a job and they're looking to advance, maybe they are in a company and they're looking to move to a different organization. The idea is that all of us find ourselves in that position at one time or another, and it can be a little bit tricky to figure out how to make that move as fluidly and efficiently and effectively as possible. So that's kind of the tips we're going to go through today. And here's how we are going to approach it. We're going to look at how to explain the value of your certification. And again, for those of you that aren't necessarily here for the certification angle, this would be the value of your education, the value of your experience, the value of completing a particular project. You can just kind of fill in the blank, even though we'll be using certification. We'll also look at a couple of different ways to use a certification for differentiation. Now, this is going to be where a little bit of my own personal views as a hiring manager, as someone who was a consultant for years, comes into play. Differentiation is an important word, I think, for us to keep in our vocabulary, because it isn't about being better than someone else. It isn't about it's never about putting someone else down or using kind of negative language. It's about separating yourself, making yourself stand out, and certification is an incredibly powerful way to do that. We'll also look at tools that are available. And you may not know they're available, you may not have thought to ask. There's lots of different ways that we miss these kind of tools that are floating out there, and the handful of tools that we'll talk about may not actually be available to everybody to the same degree. So I had a little glitch I had to handle there. We're also going to talk about what hiring managers think, and primarily what I'm going to base that discussion off of is the hiring trends report that NISM put together actually this year in 2018. The link for that full report is in the chat box right now. If you haven't downloaded a copy of that, I encourage you to do so. I think you'll find the findings pretty fun and interesting, and I'll talk more about them later. If you are listening to this recording, depending on how you got to it, we may have sent you a link with this video, but you can always go to the nismonline.org website and search for hiring trends, and the 2018 report will pop up. And then throughout the webinar, we'll actually be talking about ideas for influencing without authority. So influencing without authority, if that's a concept you're not familiar with, or if you haven't heard that term before, I would encourage you to check it out. Most people, once they learn what it is, can immediately identify some kind of an environment or situation or even person that this applies to. Essentially, it is the people that can make things happen even though they don't have the money or the title or the power to force something to happen. So I think the most obvious example that people can relate to is if you've ever been on a work team that had like a team leader that technically made the decisions, right? They balanced the budget, they did all these things, but there was someone else on the team, a peer on the team, that really had more influence than anyone else on what the group would or would not do or say or get behind. That's an example of influencing without authority. Now, what does that have to do with certification? It's got a couple of different ties that will probably become a little bit more apparent as we talk, but it's certainly you're certainly influencing if you're looking to land a consulting job or if you're interested in gaining a new position. But also when you have a position within an organization, you find yourself using that influence without authority a fair amount, oftentimes. Okay, without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into our first topic, which is differentiation. So we're going to look at 3 different ways to use your certification to differentiate yourself from your competition. I was so excited about that word and I could barely spit it out. Since we have had a few people who have joined us a little bit late, I will just really quickly recap the importance of this term differentiation and the importance of staying positive. I have received, I have given and heard many stories of people who have interviewed very talented candidates who have been turned off simply by the fact that while they were speaking very positively about themselves, they couldn't seem to do so without putting other people down. So this is things like, yes, I accomplished these 7 great things at my organization, and no one there appreciates me. It's little things like that that we have to be really aware of. It's great to talk to your spouse about things like that. Go ahead and complain at happy hour if you want, assuming that's a safe environment and you're not gonna it's not gonna get back to your boss. But that kind of oh boy, what is the best way to describe it? Negativity doesn't feel like it encompasses it enough. It's almost like a pity party, right? Tends to be a huge turnoff for people that are trying to listen to the skills and abilities that you are sharing with them. So just be aware of that as we talk about all of these components. That should always be something that is an underlying piece of advice that you can take to heart. So before you say, oh my goodness, Amy, you have broken the cardinal rule of presentations and put far too much text on this screen, please grant me just a little bit of forgiveness, because what I wanted to demonstrate is that for almost any credential, so whether we're talking about a certification like the SMS certification that's highlighted here, or we're talking about a degree or a project or anything, there is probably a written basic description of what you've accomplished available to you somewhere. Now, one of the things that we said in this webinar's description was that we talk about how to get these messages out, this promotion out about yourself through LinkedIn, your resume, and in conversations. And this is actually a fantastic place to start. A lot of people sit down and they go to add content to their LinkedIn profile. And the first really common error that I hear is people take like a day off of work, or they decide that this Sunday they're going to write their LinkedIn profile, and they try to do it all at once. And it is not a recommended approach, because what often happens is your best content will kind of evolve over time. So what I usually recommend that people do is, once they have a focus on adding content to their LinkedIn profile, that they work on it a little bit at a time, 15 minutes a day, a half an hour here and there, because then they're taking this constant kind of fresh look and they're writing just one section at a time. Now, if you do that, you want to make sure you go into your settings and turn off your auto updates, because otherwise people are going to like daily get updates that you're adding and making changes to your profile. So you want to avoid that. But otherwise, that's hands down the recommended approach. And that constant kind of freshness, it's just going to give you better content. So the second big challenge that I often hear from people is they say, I just don't know what to write. I don't know what words to use. It takes so much energy. It's so hard for me to figure out. And what a lot of people overlook is that a lot of what you need has been written for you. even if you have to rewrite it a little bit. So let's say, what I've shared here is just one tiny piece of information that's available on the NISM website. But if you've got a PMP, or if you did a master's degree in social media strategy, or whatever it is, somewhere along the line, there is a course description. You might have uh, detailed syllabi. You might have even posts advertising what all is involved in whatever the credential is that you're sharing. That is your starting point. That's the language that you can use and kind of formulate to put into your own LinkedIn profile and resume. And we'll talk about this more in a second, language that you'll eventually kind of work into conversations. So I don't recommend that you copy and paste it. Typically, the language doesn't match the language and kind of tone that you have set up for yourself in either your LinkedIn profile or your CV. Plus, it's just in general a good idea to reframe things and kind of make them your own. Although I highly doubt anyone would accuse you of plagiarism or anything along those lines. It's just a nice idea to make it your own. You'll probably have to either shorten it or add to it, depending on what you're working with, but this can take 90% of the stress out of writing all this content out of your work. Now, as you're going through this, so I've got these blue arrows on the screen, right? A great place to start is by highlighting the keywords or components. So when you think about your certification or your credential, what is the most important thing or things that really made that credential valuable? And you can figure this out a couple of different ways. It might be why you decided to pursue the credential. It might be what the credentialing body emphasizes the most. It could be what your peer group talks the most about, emphasizes the most. A lot of times when I talk to people about this kind of decision, they haven't ever really given it a lot of thought, but it's there. They know the answer. It's just that nobody's really ever asked them before. So it just takes a few minutes to think through, you know what really stands out about this is XYZ. So when we look at the SMS certification, there are a couple of things in my mind that really make it stand out, and other people may choose something different. But I think how the exam was developed is a huge component, so that would be something that I would talk about. And then I think the 6 specific content domains are a really important piece that I would want to include in any description. Now, this is above and beyond a basic description, right? You can't just like jump in with the details. But those are 2 things that, again, personally, when I look at the people that I work with, the circles that I'm in, those are the things that make the credential stand out for me. So that's what I would include LinkedIn and in a CV. Now, how does that translate to conversations that you're having with people? So let's say now you are in an interview or you're at a networking event or something along those lines. You're not going to have your LinkedIn profile open or the description of your credential written on a little postcard, right? And if you did, that would just be so awkward. So do not do that. But what you can do is practice and learn kind of some of those key concepts. Because within those key concepts, what you'll find is when you understand them as kind of a sentiment or a thought, you can fairly easily work them into a conversation. So someone might literally open the door for you and say, oh, I see that you've got an SMS certification. I'm not that familiar. Can you tell me a little bit about it? And we'll talk about this next. There's a couple of different approaches to answering that question, but one of them really is highlighting those keywords and components and saying, yeah, and you know what? Probably the easiest way for me to explain it to you is to tell you why I chose to pursue it. Here's why it's the greatest thing ever. That gives them insight into you and what you value while simultaneously educating them as to the value of the credential that you do hold. So with that, let's go ahead and take a look at our second step. So remember, we've got 3 of these of ways that we can differentiate ourselves when we are talking on LinkedIn, on our CV, or in a resume about our credentials. So another big component that I think people miss is the opportunity to explain their journey. So does that sound dramatic? I don't, maybe it sounds too dramatic, but it really is a journey. When someone sets out to either complete a certification or any other kind of credential, at some point they make a decision and then a series of other steps typically follow. By talking through that process, and don't belabor the point, right? But if the opportunity presents itself, you might share, yes, in 2017, I made the decision that I wanted to increase my professional standing in the social media strategy community. And when I explored the different options for doing that, I found a certification would be the best route because certifications require maintenance, because certifications mean that you become part of a community, because this particular SMS certification through NISM is platform agnostic and would be very universal, right? Like you can share with them your decision making process. Now, what are you doing there? It's a win-win again. You're letting them know about you and what you value, what's important to you, the thoughtfulness that you put into this process, while you're simultaneously educating them as to why the credential that you're sharing is so valuable. So again, you're not going to go on for days about this, but you can kind of explain your journey and say, yeah, so I picked this, and maybe you even share some other things you considered. I thought it was a great idea to also pursue my master's degree, but I was able to use the information that I already had to obtain my certification within just a few months, where a master's degree would have taken a year, right? Like you can talk through kind of some of that if it fits and if it feels right. But otherwise, you can then go on to say, this was something that I worked on for several months. The studying included learning more about compliance and governance and strategic planning, which I learned of the 6 content domains were the 2 areas that I needed to learn more about. I was excited to learn that research and analysis was a component because that's actually already one of my greatest strengths. So I just had to kind of brush up on things a little bit there. So kind of hear what I'm doing, where we're not over explaining the point, but sharing a little bit of the insights again to add to the kind of richness of the accomplishment. And then you can share, you took the test. I couldn't think of a better way to represent that. Pencil. Pencil will always be taking a test to me. Welcome to 2018. No one takes tests with pencils anymore, do they? But then you ended up at the end result, you had your certification, and this is what it's meant to your professional career. Lots of opportunities to um, kind of expand and add your personality to this conversation. But the point is, too many of us jump right to the end when they say, well, tell me a little bit about your credentials. And you say, yep, well, I have a social media strategy certification through the National Institute for Social Media, and that was super hard, and I worked really hard to get it, but now I have it. And I work as a social media consultant, and that's the end of the story. And you left out like 98% of your journey and almost all of what they wanted to learn about you. So don't be afraid to share that part of it. So finally, the third step is talking about your own motivation. And motivation is kind of a funny thing, because when I'm talking to my students and they're prepping for their certification exam, I tell them to just get real. I don't care what their motivation is. I don't care if it's because their sister doesn't think they can do it, or if it's because they hate their job and they hate their boss, and this is the thing they need to get out from under that. It can be as mean and ugly and horrible as it is honest when it comes to motivating yourself to study and get through those hard parts. But when you are actually transitioning to sharing your motivation in a professional setting, you're going to want to clean that up a bit. Hang on just a second, guys. So sorry about that. If you couldn't tell, I'm going through a little bit of losing my voice, so I'm hoping it will hang on through to the end of the webinar. And I may have to take a break or two here or there to cough a little bit and change cough drops, but In any case, back to motivation. So what was it that not only made you make the decision, but made you make all those changes in your life? So it's very difficult, right? You have to, instead of coming home and maybe watching your favorite TV show, you have to go home and lock yourself in your home office and do some studying and some reading. It's nobody's first choice. So there was something that motivated you to make that decision. What was it? There are a lot of really great ones that you may underestimate. For example, a great motivation is just advancing your career, being able to have a bigger impact. One of my favorites to hear is when someone describes that they know they have this tremendous potential and they can't seem to get people to give them a chance. So they went and they pursued this certification or credential or whatever it is because they knew it would help people listen to them and hear what they had to contribute to the conversation. So a little trickier piece of motivation. I feel like motivation is pretty easy to imagine in that conversation setting, in that interview setting. It's a little dicier when we look at how do we put motivation on LinkedIn or on our resume. I agree. It's not necessarily a clean fit, but in a lot of the descriptions, the opening on LinkedIn, or if you have kind of an opening on your CV, you can add a little bit of your own voice and talk a little bit about your own journey. And that might be the perfect place to describe your motivation as it stands. Something to consider there. So, 3 considerations for differentiating yourself in the job market and how those considerations can kind of come to life on various platforms and tools that you use to connect with people that are either your ticket to landing a consulting gig or getting a new job or getting a promotion, or maybe you're not even changing jobs. Maybe you're just trying to do more within your own environment, right? So let's take a look at our next topic. As promised, I was going to talk a little bit about our HR study. I'll remind you again, and especially for the people who logged in a little bit later, if you go into the chat window, you will see the link to download a free copy of the HR study or social media trends report, I believe is what we have officially named it. So it's a long report, but a couple of the highlights that I wanted to share, I think you might find kind of interesting because when we did the study, we had absolutely no expectations that everybody would come back and say, a certification is better than everything all the time in every scenario, right? I mean, if we had come back with that, I think you guys are all smart enough that you would have said, I think they're not telling the truth here. So we didn't expect that. That wasn't what the report showed. The report did show a lot of people favored a certification and a lot of people saw the value of a certification. Even if they didn't fully understand the specific certification, we did see a lot of positive responses to that. And that first bubble kind of shares that. One of the quotes from our study was that a certification seems more cutting edge. And by more, the context of that was compared to a degree, compared to work experience. When someone pursues a certification, there's just kind of an element to it that is impressive. It's someone that is staying on top of things. Another thing that emerged, which I think of everything, this was the one that kind of surprised me the most. Job titles really mattered. So when we're looking at the big picture, so you have your certification, and this matters, I think, a lot to the people in the social media strategy community, because we see so many people that come to get their certification because they've been working in a job where they had social media as part of their work, but it didn't align with their actual job title. So I'll give you an example. Let's say it was a human resources specialist was the job title in a medium-sized company. Now, within that job, they were responsible for online recruiting and posting of jobs and kind of maintaining a healthy digital presence so that their recruitment efforts would attract the top-notch people, right? Because that's how recruiting works now. People go and they check out the company online. So the challenge with being an HR specialist, I think that's what I named that person, is that Once they fall in love with the work of social media strategy and they try to move to a social media strategist role, which is actually very similar to the role that they've been doing, their job title doesn't reflect that. So now they're stuck. So people come to us and they say, I need a way to demonstrate that I know this stuff, that I know what I'm talking about, because I'm trying to make this transition. So we work with a lot of people in that scenario, and we were surprised to learn that when we talk to all of these HR professionals that were hiring managers and making all these decisions, they really do look at job titles when they skim a resume. So that person that was an HR specialist that's applying for a social media strategy job may struggle to get that call. Now we're hoping that putting at the top of that resume, I'm a certified social media strategist, active, that will overcome that and give that hiring manager pause to at least read through the job description so they can see just how much the job does align with it. The other piece that we want people to take away from this is don't be a passive participator in your own career. If you have the opportunity to request a change in your job title that more accurately reflects the work that you do, please take advantage. Please pursue that. It is, in the long run, even if you're not looking to make a change now, in your best interest. So here was another interesting thing that we learned. Whoops. Oh dear, my Prezi has just gotten out of control. All right, it seems to be behaving again. So 58% of the people that we interviewed selected a candidate with more experience but no formal education. So a little over half. So we were curious about that. So we asked. We did follow-up interviews. So we did online survey to collect our initial data, and then we did follow-up interviews. And specifically around this question, we said, what is the deal? Why are you gravitating towards someone with experience but no formal education? And a lot of times, a very common response was that it wasn't that a certification and education isn't valuable. They did value that. And by the way, not just the information that you learn, but just the fact that you pursue a certification, that you do go back to school and get your formal education. It was actually that if they had to choose, 58% of them would rather have somebody that is out there doing the work than somebody that has completed a degree. So it wasn't that they only value experience or that they don't value education. It was that we put them in a position where they had to pick. And when they had to pick, someone who has proven what they can do through experience was the one that won out. Now, you might think, this is very bad for you, Amy. Why are you telling people that? It seems to be counterintuitive to encouraging people to pursue certification, but it really isn't, because it's really important to remember that certifications, at least, I can't speak if you're here for another credential, I can't speak to that. But certifications are the ones that demonstrate an industry standard of knowledge that reflects your experience. So some of this is educating our hiring managers as to what a certification does really represent. So that goes back to our 3 little conversation tasks, right? So helping them understand in that interview or in those conversations that what this certification means is that not only do I have the experience, but I have the experience to such an extent, I have passed an industry standard exam that demonstrates that. So that they do go hand in hand, as long as we can get that messaging across to the hiring managers to help them understand their value. So again, if you didn't catch it before, the download link is in the chat window, and if you haven't downloaded it yet, I would strongly encourage you to do so. It is an interesting read, and hopefully you can pick up a few tips there. So finally, here we are talking about tools. So in the bottom left-hand corner, you see a little radio icon, hopefully, and a indication of everybody's favorite radio station. So if you haven't heard this before, WIIFM is everybody's favorite radio station because it's what's in it for me. And we can joke about that sounding selfish, or maybe even we might say that's a bad thing. But the fact is, it's human nature. And I wanted to take just a moment to talk about that, because I really encourage people to accept the fact that we're all operating from the standpoint of what's in it for me to at least some extent. So when you are looking to advance your credentials, to get funding from your organization, to do some kind of continuing education, a lot of people will go into a conversation with their manager, or they'll fill out paperwork, or they'll do whatever, and they will talk about how the funding and the education and whatever it is that they're working on will actually benefit them, the employee. Now, in cases where no one is really reviewing these requests, and you get $1,000 and nobody really cares how you spend it, you don't have to put that much thought into it. But if you actually have to get approval, what you need to talk about is what's in it for the company, right? So there are still, sadly, a good chunk of organizations that will be resistant to continuing education simply because they have a belief that if someone improves themselves by learning more or pursuing education, they're just going to go off and get a better job. The way that I respond to that is, if you don't want people to improve themselves and go and get a better job, foster a healthy work environment so that they don't want to leave, right? And I don't say that lightly. I'm not saying that that's an easy thing to do, but honestly, isn't that kind of obvious? If you don't want people to leave, don't foster a cruddy work environment. So, but all of that aside, you could still have people that are resistant to continuing education, and this may or may not fix that. But let's assume we're going into a neutral environment, and you have to, in whatever role you have, talk to the supervisor, the HR person, whoever is signing off on your info, about why what you're asking to do will make you more effective in your current job. You want to talk to them about how your day-to-day work will be improved. That mindset shift alone can be the biggest difference maker, because we just naturally, when we talk about work we're going to do and continuing education we're going to pursue, we naturally think about ourselves. So think about your organization. Now, the next step is, what on earth do you talk about? How do you know what to say? How do you know how to connect those dots? So first, potential resource for you, we'll call it a resource, is you have that lovely course or exam description. So let's say it is a certification exam. There is likely a prep course, and there is likely an exam description, because for most certifications you can do one, the other, or both. If you are submitting to have reimbursement for completing a prep course, go to that course page and look at the work you're going to be asked to do, the content that's going to be covered, any special projects. Look at who's teaching the classes. Try to pull anything that would be meaningful to the person or persons that you're speaking to about getting funding. Share that information. Don't assume they'll fully make the connection to your work, right? Help them make that connection. Literally tell them, and this is how I will benefit, or this is how the company will benefit. And then do the same thing for the exam. And then by being able to demonstrate, this on the exam, I'll have reinforced I have this learning. And especially if you're in a role that is customer facing, you can also talk about how having this credential will elevate our status within our community, how it will help our customers see us and kind of perceive us in a different light, in a kind of more respected fashion, right? But this entire time, yes, you're doing the work, but you're talking about how you will benefit, and those benefits will translate to the needs of the organization. Second, oftentimes schools, certifications, all kinds of places have something called a request for consideration, or some version of that. I think there are a variety of different names, but essentially what a request for, if you need another example, conferences have this a lot as well. A request for consideration is pretty straightforward. It is an outline written by the organization that you can download, input your own information as needed, but essentially the company that hosts the exam has written all of the important information for you. So all you have to do is hand it over to your hiring manager or whoever is deciding about the funding. So for example, NISM has this on their site. If you search for a request for consideration, it's a free download. Anybody can print it off, send it off to their supervising manager, and it gives them an outline of the costs, of everything that's covered, and kind of all the high points. Now, some people take this and they modify it and they add kind of those connectors. They'll say, and this is how this information would be used in my job, right? And don't underestimate the power of outright stating things like that. Just because you know your job inside and out doesn't mean that your boss doesn't mean that the HR manager does. Never assume that they're going to understand why this is important to you or why it's a benefit to the company. So take a few minutes to draw those conclusions, but oh my goodness, if the credentialing you're going after has a request for consideration, it's 90% of the work that's already been done for you, and it's typically written extremely well and at a level that just kind of covers everything that needs to be done. So take a look for that. I have also, by the way, for a few companies, submitted that as a suggestion. I just did for a group here in Minnesota. NISM is out of Minnesota. And I was at a meeting and they were talking about upping membership and things like that. And I went through their whole website and I said, one great way to help people is by writing a request for consideration. And it was so funny because I looked at this board and they looked at me like they had never heard of such a thing. But once you explain the concept, you realize it's such a great fit for so many different situations. And the last piece is to consider and to look at case studies. So why case studies? Case studies tend to help people translate the intangible or the kind of high level considerations into the real world. So you will notice that actually a really good place to find some case studies are on social media sites. So like Twitter for Business has a bunch of them, Facebook has quite a few. And they tell these stories of people who have done or purchased something. And in that process, they have kind of measurable, very tangible results. And they explain it in a way where they walk the person through the journey. This is why I decided to do this. And then they're able to talk about on the other side why it was a good move for them and for their organization. Now, it's not necessarily going to be a slam dunk, but if you're talking to someone who is having trouble visualizing the benefit of this specific thing, right? If they're having trouble with that component of it, this can be a great way to kind of connect those dots for them and leave them going, oh, I get it. I see now why I might pursue, something like this or go this path, or I see how the $1,000 investment is worth it and could come back to me. So look for case studies. If case studies aren't present, you can always inquire. Not everybody has them. Not everybody has all of these things, but it at least gives you a place to start, something to search for that can kind of make your journey a little bit easier. So with that, fortunately, we're wrapping up a tiny bit early since I can feel my voice starting to go again. But I did have at least one question that came in on the chat, and I want to make sure to address those. So one of them, great question about staying positive. So how do you respond positively to a question about why you're looking to leave your organization? So this is a good question, and it is going to vary, I think, by situation. We'll put it that way. I still stand by the fact that you always want to stay positive, and I will also add that while you're staying positive, people are also very capable of reading between the lines. So if you happen to be working in an environment that is not really allowing you to grow or has kind of some substantial challenges built into it, the way that you talk in a positive light will probably kind of allude to that anyway. So you'll probably send a little bit of a message no matter what. But try looking at the flip side of whatever it is that is bothering you. So for example, if you have a boss that's a micromanager, you might share that you're excited to explore an opportunity where you're able to have greater decision-making powers, right? Every negative has the other side of the coin that sends the exact same message. And it sometimes just takes a moment to figure it out. So especially if the reason you want to lose your job is because your boss is like a horrible, horrible person that you just think is evil incarnate, right? And you don't even know how to describe it. Um, you and she just clash incredibly, and you think, well, I can't say that, right? Like I can't describe this horrible person in a positive way, but you can describe the kind of working relationship you're looking for, or the kind of office environment that you're seeking. So I hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. But if you're really stuck on um, the fact that you're in a bad spot and there's no good way to describe it, try writing down the bad things, draw a line down the middle of the paper, and then draw the inverse of that negative, or write the inverse of that negative on the other side. And I do literally mean write this out, because then in a conversation, what will pop out are those words that you wrote on the right hand side. Hopefully that was helpful. And just one more quick reminder, if you do have specific questions, go ahead and chat them in. Another question came in about funding, just a question about what is a reasonable request for funding in a typical organization? That is a really, really hard question to answer, because there is a wide variety of options there. A lot of times really small companies won't even have guidelines. So you just kind of have to go in and say, the price is what it is. I'm kind of hoping for funding. If you're worried about the ticket price being too high, try asking for a partial funding. I mean, something is better than nothing. Or maybe negotiate partial. Always go in and ask for it all. Why not? But be prepared to negotiate for something partial. I know that in really large organizations, it's not uncommon for, in your HR manual, to you just go through and every single employee has a set dollar amount, and it is what it is. There's no negotiation. It's set in stone. In those cases, you're typically, the experience has been you're pretty stuck. But again, it falls in that category of something is better than nothing. I would say, if you don't have clear-cut guidelines like those Fortune 50 companies typically have, go into the initial conversation fully armed with those tools and resources that we shared. Go in with the things like the description and the high value, because that's going to increase your chances that you're going to get somebody that says, oh, hey, I get why this is a little bit more than the cap that we put on our continuing ed, but we really want somebody in our organization that is going to have these credentials. And we did have one more that came in. Tips for talking to some, okay, this I mentioned briefly. Tips about talking to somebody who has that fear that you're going to get all smart and then go get another job. So that is a tricky one. I typically find people that have been in the job market for a long time are more inclined towards this concern. And I just want to acknowledge it's a real concern, right? Nobody wants to pump $2,000 into someone, have them finish a credential, and then quit the next day. And sometimes these hard feelings come from past experiences where maybe exactly that has happened. So how do you get over that? I think honest conversations are the most helpful. And I really think the biggest kind of way to turn that ship, as it were, is to talk about how, hey, while I'm in this 2-month class, or while I'm doing this, I'm going to be doing these projects. I'm going to be working on this. I'm going to be applying this specific information to my job, and I'm going to be making things better here. So the more you can talk about why your interest is tied to your current job, the more those fears will be alleviated. Now, I would love to say that that will work every time, but the fact of the matter is, if you do have someone like that in your environment, there just may be no way around it. It is a really, really challenging obstacle. Oh, sorry, I'll add one other thing. In some cases, if there are, don't go over someone's head. I just want to be very clear about that. That ends badly. But if you do have someone that could help you make your case, sometimes bouncing your ideas off another, maybe someone who can influence without authority, can also be a really great resource for you. All right, so with that, I just do another quick check here. I don't see any new questions. So thank you guys all for spending time with us today. I appreciate you putting up with my little bit of a losing voice here. So hopefully that wasn't too distracting. If you have additional follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out to us at NISM and join us for future webinars, of course. And don't forget to download that free copy of the social media job study, or the HR study that we had completed. Again, the link is in the chat. Thanks so much, everybody, and have a great rest of your day.